What I'm going to be talking about today is actually what are the kinds of careers? I think we have a lot of students here in the audience, and so for a lot of people who are trying to get into the field, my talk is going to be focused on what are the kinds of career landscape, what is the careers paths for you in this field, right? And so before I kind of really start talking about these career paths, I'm going to just give a little bit more about myself. So I'm currently a data science lead within the Microsoft Windows division. A lot of the work we do is we work with Windows related data science and problems. I have a background of a PhD in computer science from Arizona State University. And I'll talk a little bit about my career path because, really the focus here is about careers. So when I started off after graduating, so actually before that, my PhD in Arizona State was focused on actually computational genomics, right? And so applying AI, applying data science to a lot of the problems in cancer research, in cancer-related data, and so on. And so after that, I decided to switch industries a little bit and move on to work with a startup. I worked with a startup for a couple of years as an individual contributor, meaning an IC who was actually working on hands-on data science. We worked with advertising data, we worked with healthcare data, a couple of different diverse data sets. And then following that, I transitioned over and joined Microsoft. And ever since then, I've been with Microsoft, working really primarily on telemetry data, which is a type of Windows data. During my career path, I started off as an individual data scientist. I've dabbed a little bit in data engineering in the course of the startup. And then after that, more recently, I've been working as a hands-on data scientist and most recently as a manager, where I lead a team of data scientists who focus on various Windows-related problems. Okay, so today what I'm going to do is actually talk to you about a couple of example careers in AI. So I'm going to pick a few different examples and really talk about what are the kinds of skills required for such careers. What do you need to be passionate about, right? Like, because we all have our interests, we all have certain characteristics and certain things that appeal to us most. And so what are the kinds of things that each of these career paths really kind of attract or really value? And then finally, of course, I'll also talk to you about just use an example to talk about what exactly that particular career, what exactly the role is. So the first path I'm going to start with is the data scientist. And before I actually talk about a data scientist, what I'm going to do is talk to you about an example. So I think you heard various different examples, right? And so this example that I'm picking and choosing here is classifying emails as spam. So let's say, all of us have email accounts. And then in our email account, if you look at the folders, you have an inbox folder, you have an outbox, you have various folders, and then you have a spam folder. And then usually most of the time, there's emails that automatically get sent to spam, and most of them end up being junk. Every now and then there'll be this really valuable email that you want to read, which will end up going into the spam folder. And so what exactly is the intelligence or the AI system that powers that? And so what powers that is typically an AI system which tries to classify, looking at emails, looking at certain specific tag words in emails, whether or not an email needs to go into the spam folder or whether it's something that's important and goes into the inbox folder. So now, pick that example, and I'm going to use that example to talk to you about what would a data scientist be doing in this context. So a data scientist is a role who really works on analyzing and exploring data. In this context, for instance, the email data, they would work off a database or a data set of emails. And then what they'll try to do is actually prototype and come up with an AI solution or an AI-based solution. And this solution doesn't always have to be new. Of course, sometimes you need new solutions. Sometimes the problems require you to come up with something new. But in this case, it doesn't always have to be new. They write code, but a lot of that code is scripting and prototype. And then once they actually prototype the solution, what they do is they actually go ahead and convince others to use their solution. Most of the times, data scientists are working in a cross team, working with other disciplines and other people. And so they need to convince the others on, okay, this is the solution I'm recommending, and I think it's a good idea to use this solution. And then of course they also want to monitor and try to tell how well the solution is doing. So in this case, for instance, let's say there's 3,000 emails that are categorized as spam. You may want to go ahead and count how many of them, those spam emails, are actually false positives or wrongly classified. So if you look at a data scientist's typical week, about 60% of their week is spent on coding. 20% is spent on presenting, talking to others, 10% on collaborating with peers, and then about 10% is spent on research, right? And so this is an example week of a data scientist and how they would spend their time. Some of the skills that are really required for a data scientist is basic math and statistics, which is pretty important. Basic coding skills, also having knowledge of machine learning and knowledge of data science techniques is definitely a plus. Data wrangling, which is a relatively newish term, which talks about really being comfortable working with data. So meaning, right from starting with very simple Excel sheets to actually working with databases, being comfortable and having that curiosity with data sets is something that's very important. And of course, communication and collaboration, because often data scientists are working with a broader team with several others. And so it's really important for you to be able to communicate and talk about the kind of areas and the kind of solutions you're building. So with that, I'm going to actually talk a little bit about a related career path, which is the career path of a program manager in data. So I spoke to you about the spam filtering system. So let's say that there was a small team building spam filtering. The data scientist would be the person responsible for actually prototyping the solution. But what the data scientist does is actually works very closely with other folks within the team. And so one of the other roles is that of a program manager. So what a program manager does in this context is they are kind of the key person who defines what the scenario is, defines the application, talks a lot about where the application would be used, what's in scope, what kind of systems you're planning here, what kind of techniques. So really defining and laying out the landscape of the entire project is what the program manager does. The other kinds of things that the program manager does is also working with to write specs and write documents that detail some of these. And then, of course, coordinating with the rest of the team. So meaning the software engineers, meaning the data scientists, meaning the managers, the leadership team, coordinating across the board is something that the program manager would do. To also come up with some of the key deliverables, the key milestones, meaning, in the next month, we're going to get, the first prototype out, or in the next 2 months is going to be the actual release. And then another important thing that the program manager does is actually sets up a lot of the regular syncs, regular meetings, and controls the rhythm of business, really to make sure that the team is working towards those common milestones and common goals. And so if you look at a typical work week, the program manager in this role would really focus a lot more on actual collaboration, presenting, meetings with others, focus a little bit on research, especially competition. So if you were trying to build a spam filtering system, the program manager would typically be the person who would be looking out to see what is out there. And then, of course, also have some amount of coding and analysis skills to be able to explore the problem and be able to come up with some of these specs and these details. So some of the strongest skills for a program manager are communication and collaboration. If you're a communicator, if you're very good at collaboration, if you're also very good at organizing events, for instance, like this event, a program manager path is something you may want to consider. And so this is essentially one more career option that you have in the entire AI landscape. Often enough, it's advertised as program manager data or data program manager. And so this is one more career option. So then I'm going to take a segue into another kind of career option, which is the option of a data engineer or a software engineer. So when you think about a data engineer, their role is primarily to be a software engineer, but focused a lot on working with data or building systems that work with data. And so what do the people who are in these careers do? So typically what they do is they come up with new algorithms, they come up with new approaches. They write code. They actually write pretty large scale code, pieces of code, so huge projects. They also build in systems to test the code. And then, of course, they make sure that the code runs properly on very large scale systems, something that's also called deploying. And so typical week for this is people who are in this profession usually spend 80% of their time in coding, in testing, in optimizing their code, improving it, making sure that it's running accurately, meaning, for instance, the spam filtering system is actually correctly classifying spam, as well as making sure that it's running fast. Because we may want a spam filtering system, but we don't want it to tag our emails and take a week for it, right? We want it to happen in a couple of minutes. And so this is kind of the role here where they're really spending time in actually turning a lot of the prototypes, turning a lot of the ideas into real working systems. In terms of the skill set that's most important here, if you're very passionate about problem solving, if you're also passionate about coding and writing code, computer science fundamentals, that's another very important area here in terms of understanding operating systems, understanding networking, distributed systems and how they work. This is a career path that you may want to consider. So with that, I'm going to take a tangent and talk about a variation in the software engineer or the data engineer role, which is a machine learning engineer. And so you'll see variations of this. You'll see also AI engineer in some companies. You'll see various variations of the engineering role. Specifically here, I'm going to talk about the machine learning engineer role. And so when I talk about this role, the example that I'm actually going to use is web search. So if you see here on the right side, you see some pictures of Microsoft Bing. So it's the search engine. It actually provides results, and you can kind of see here some of the results that for just searching for machine learning engineer. So what does a machine learning engineer do? So the machine learning engineer is a more specialized software engineer. And so what they do is they write production code, and they're really focused on deploying machine learning models at scale. So what that means is taking a machine learning model. So in this case, for instance, there's a machine learning model that powers the search results, the search queries, and turning that into something that would operate on scale, meaning operate on the entire, say, Bing outreach or all the different people who use Bing. And so what they do is they also coordinate with other teams and coordinate with other sub portions of the same team to actually provide a unified offering. So one example would be you could think of there's a specific team which is focused on the core search, the search algorithms. There's another team which is focused on, say, this sidebar. And then there's another team which is focused on relevance and context, which are all important in the context of web search. And so what the machine learning engineer does is works towards actually coding up and deploying the machine learning system at scale. So typical work week here is involves very similar to a software engineer, 70% coding, 70% of the time is spent on implementation, testing, optimizing code. 20%, so these engineers tend to spend a little more time on research because often enough, they're not just implementing existing algorithms, but coming up with newer ways to actually do this better. So for instance, if you're able to improve the relevance of your search results, that could be something very, very impactful in this field. And then, of course, they also spend time actually collaborating with others and communicating with the rest of the team. And in terms of skills, software engineering is one of the core skills here. Additionally, machine learning skills, artificial intelligence skills, knowledge of data science, and some of the foundational knowledge of algorithms in this space is very, very helpful. So hopefully that provides you a view into a couple of different areas within this space. And then finally, what I'm going to talk about is the data analyst role. So the data analyst role is a role which really focuses upon coming up with ways in which we can visualize and analyze data and present it in broader forums. And so if you look at the example here on the right side, you see there's a couple snapshots of Power BI dashboards. And so what these dashboards are showing is they're showing a sales application. And so this is sales across various different stores. You can compare against last year's sales, look at this year's sales, as well as look at the distribution of the sales with a map across various geographic regions. And so what the data analyst is doing in this context is actually working with this data behind the scenes, cooking this data or processing this data in a way that it's easy to consume externally in a dashboard, and then actually communicating and sharing this back with others. And so the data analyst is somebody who's needs to be very familiar with scripting. And so most of their time is actually spent on scripting. They're also spending time on actually writing queries to analyze the data and different ways in which they can take a look at the data. And then, of course, they spend some amount of time collaborating with others in order to really make sure that they're communicating some of the key insights from the data that they're looking at. If you think about the skills, if you are interested in data, for a lot of people, when people come to me and talk to me about, hey, I'm very interested in getting into the data science field, what's a good place to start? I do recommend you start, looking at just the basic data analysis. And part of the reason for that is you start building familiarity with data sets. You start exploring the data sets. You start understanding how data looks. What are some of the nuances of data, missing data, some of the, kind of clean versus dirty data. So you'll find weird data in your data set sometimes. And so you start really building that familiarity when you start getting into data analysis. And so this is usually a pretty common role across the board in various different organizations and various different industries. So some other notes. I did mention a lot of the career paths or career profiles that I actually spoke about were individual contributor or individual roles. There's also lead roles within all of these. And so typical progression is you start off with growing as an individual contributor and then gradually move towards more lead roles if you have an interest in actually leading teams and managing various people. And then also a couple of other notes is company size. So it's always helpful to think about the various nuances of working in different company sizes. Microsoft, for instance, is a very large company. And so we have a lot of different roles and we have a lot of different variety in the roles and the application areas that you would work on. With smaller businesses or smaller companies, such as startups, you're focused more on a single application or single specific area. Industry versus academia. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. That's another common question I get asked. Should I actually pursue a PhD in this field? Should I go directly and start working in the industry? And so the thoughts there are ultimately it comes down into what you're most passionate about. I did spend some time in the academic field, but there are always ways, as we saw in the previous talk, for you to merge the two, where you're doing research concurrently while also working in the industry. And so there's multiple different options there and really comes down into what you're most passionate about. And then finally, even if you think about the industry, there's multiple different industries. We have quite a bit of variety here in where data science could be applied and AI could be applied. And types of data, again, when you think about various industries, it also comes down into various types of data. And so that's, again, another area where there's a lot of diversity in terms of the different types of data that you're working with. For instance, you could be working with telemetry data, search data, weather data, which is a very interesting data set that I've had the opportunity to work with. I think we saw some of that even in the context of the FarmBeats application. And so there's a lot of different problem spaces within this area, and you could pick and choose which one that you're most passionate about. Okay. With that, I'm at the end of my talk. Thank you so much again for this opportunity. I hopefully provided a quick flavor into career paths in data science. Happy to hand it over back to you, Sanjay.
So great talk. Thank you so much so far. And I have a couple of questions for you from the audience. So number one, how to become data scientist and how can we start early in our career?
So I think there's a lot of different ways to start. One good way to start, for instance, is there are a lot of online websites like Kaggle. Kaggle provides competitions, and they provide very easy data sets that you can get started with. And so that is one area to start with. Happy to post some of the links in the chat window and actually share some of those resources.
Awesome. And how is AI helping in filtering spam emails?
So AI helps in filtering spam in a couple of ways. So for instance, where AI, one subfield of AI is what we call classification. And so filtering spam, for instance, is an excellent example of where you would use a classification algorithm. And so the kind of algorithms there are logistic regression, a couple of different flavors of algorithms. And so where AI helps is the engine that powers that is actually some form of intelligence, which distinguishes between what is a real email and what is actually spam.
I see. So then another question is, what language is used to program these filters that you may have shown?
So the languages used to program these filters is pretty diverse. There's a broad set of languages. I can speak a little bit about some of the languages that we've used within our team. I know there's also lots of platforms that are used. And so like some of them include Python, some of them include Spark and PySpark and some of those languages. Additionally, R is another very popular language that's used. And then of course, when you need speed, sometimes you just end up going back into C++ or some of the core actual languages in order to actually build and write the code. Scala is another very popular language that is used here. And actually, Tom, who's the next speaker, has a lot of familiarity. He's written even books on PySpark. So he has tremendous familiarity with those languages. And so, I'm sure we can share more.